Hello, welcome to ARonAR. I'm Adam Rose, and today I'm going to be looking at how you could stage your own adventure race. And this is particularly helpful in a training context, not only for you, but for your team, of course, and then even better for the wider adventure racing community. Because it's one thing to go running up and down hills and building your fitness and your endurance. It's far better, far more productive to simulate real race conditions competing against other teams. And it's something I just did last week. So last week, as I said, I staged an adventure race. Now, one of the biggest obstacles to people staging events, no matter, especially in first world countries around the world, tends to be legal issues. So usually in the form of insurances that you need to provide, which can be very, very expensive, and secondly, permissions for the terrain that you're covering. And that can be such an obstacle that some people just end up never staging a race at all. And the insurance companies are justifiably nervous about insuring an adventure race because adventure races by their very nature are very unpredictable. You don't have a fixed course, you don't have marshals, it's 24 hours a day. So I still wanted to stage an event and I didn't want to incur these responsibilities and or liabilities. So the simple method I adopted was I invited, invitation only, a bunch of friends to come along and train, right? So first and foremost, my team members and myself, we want to train together, do some mountain biking and some trekking and some kayaking. And then the reason to invite these other teams along is because it's far more interesting and far more dynamic if you're competing against other teams. And there was quite a lot of interest, and most importantly, it was not done under the umbrella of any formal organization or company. I do have an events company, Walter Adventure Racing Limited, but I was not staging it under that umbrella. It was purely a bunch of friends getting together to do some training. So here in the UK, if you want to go run around the hills or go biking or kayaking, you don't need to ask permission. There's public access to a lot of national parks and open terrain like that. So I am legally within my rights to go and do that. And if I ask a bunch of my friends to come along and join me in that endeavor, again, no problem. And I made it very explicit to everybody who entered saying, this is purely us training. You cannot appeal to any higher authority, certainly not to any legal entity. If anything goes wrong, if you get injured, that's on you. If you need help, you don't come to me. There is no race director. There are no race staff or event staff. You simply call the local mountain rescue or the emergency services, and you would do like any hiker in the mountains here. And it was very successful. And it's not the first time I've done this. I've done this before with my team and then extended the invitation to a wider group of friends. And I intend to continue doing these things. And I just want to show you how you can do this because really it's much more achievable than you might imagine. And in so doing, hopefully more people will stage these, which just helps the growth of adventure racing. Okay, so first consideration, make it as real as possible. Presumably in staging an event, an adventure race like this, you have participated in them yourself. That's why you want to do this. So, make it as varied and as interesting as you can for your benefit and, of course, for the benefit of anybody else who's going to take part in it. So make it, competitive. So, you've got a goal that you want to go and achieve. It's not simply, let's just walk up this hill, let's just walk up this mountain or walk down this bike along this trail. Set it out as close to the real thing as you can. Just get a bunch of friends and or interested parties together and be very clear in specifying that there's no business involvement and there's no liability accepted by anybody. You're completely on your own and your responsibility is your own. You could even get them to sign a waiver. I just put up a Google form, everybody filled out that form, they read the disclaimer and they signed on the dotted line. So whether that would hold up in a court of law is a separate issue, but at least it expresses the intent and understanding of everybody's taking part, that they didn't go under any misconception that somebody was supervising or taking kind of a race director role for the particular event. Find a cool, challenging location. So here in North Wales, obviously we've got Snowdonia, so we've got many, many mountains around here. We've got gorges, rivers, we've got the ocean, all sorts of things like that. So, try and make it as interesting as possible because adventure racing is not just about racing, it's about adventure, as I said before. So the more varied and challenging the terrain, the better it is for everybody who comes along. Okay, so once you've picked the terrain or the location where you hope to stage the race, the next step is to find a race base, because you're not going to be doing just one discipline and out and back. You're going to be doing multiple disciplines. So you need some place where people can stash their gear. At the very least, presumably you're going to have a mountain biking component, so you need a place where people can put their bikes. So for me, that was finding the race base, and that required a lot of phone calls, a lot of liaising with various village halls, town halls, community centers, things like that, and phoning them up and finding out was it possible, especially under the COVID restrictions that we're experiencing right now, to use their facilities as a race base. In my case, all the hostels and town halls or village halls were shut because of COVID, but what I was able to secure was a secure storage cage, really, for the mountain bikes. So while we're out trekking and kayaking, at least people could rest assured that their bikes were safe and protected. One of the problems with creating an adventure race is having to go out and scout all the locations. Now, what I tend to do is I start off with the maps. Rather than going out to the location itself, I do all my planning on the maps. And one of the reasons I do that is because I want to do the race or the event myself. So I literally don't want to go out and scout the CP locations, because that takes away the adventure and the fun for me. And if I'm competing, either just with my team or against other teams, it's an unfair advantage if I've been to that location ahead of time. So I have found that you can do pretty much all your planning with a bit of creativity from the comfort of your computer. So I'm using, in this case, ordnance survey mapping, open street maps, tourist information, anything like that, where you can find, curious locations, waterfalls, caves, rivers, all sorts of things like that. Obviously, I know the terrain vaguely, as in I live in this area, so I've got some idea what the mountains are like, what there is to offer. But you can do all the planning and even the CP positioning without ever visiting the race course beforehand. Okay, a fundamental decision that you need to make is the event going to be a score event, where people can pick up all the CPs in any order they like within a particular discipline. So mountain biking, they could pick up whichever CPs. So that's a score event, or it could be linear. And I personally prefer linear events, both for myself, but also for the teams that are participating, because I want to take them on a journey. I don't want just people running headless all over the different directions. I want to take them on their journey. And typically, your longer adventure races, your expedition races are linear by nature. So you have to get the CPs in a certain order. You can't jump backwards and forwards, skipping numbers and coming back and picking up other ones afterwards. So that's a fundamental decision in the structure of your race. And I would argue, I suppose, that the short events are probably going to lend themselves more to score, because you don't have that much time to go on this journey. Whereas in my case, I'm generally wanting to make these things at least 12 hours, maybe 24 hours long. So I want all the teams to follow the journey that I have in mind. It's far more interesting, far more challenging, and quite useful actually after the event, where teams can compare how they did and look at the routes that they took, and that is a learning curve in itself. Okay, now in terms of choosing the checkpoints themselves, I have a fairly simple logic. I'm looking for anything permanent. So, the mountains or hills here in the UK, the highest points often have what is called a trig beacon, as you can see in this picture. And even better than that, not only is it a beacon, it's got a number usually visible on a steel plate at the base of the trig beacon. So literally, for people to prove that they've been to that particular trig beacon, they would have to visit it and then write down the number of the trig beacon. Okay, and or take a photograph of the base plate, which is obviously going to show the number on the trig beacon. So trig beacons for me are a natural checkpoint, and being on top of mountains or hills, that in itself makes it challenging just to get to them. So that's kind of beneficial. I'll also use things like street signs, caves, significant historical monuments and or structures. So it might be a particular building of note, and they have to take a photograph of the notice board outside that building. Or it could even be a particular set of physical features. So it might be a tree in an otherwise treeless landscape. It's going to stand out very easily. There isn't a flag there for the teams to identify that they found the checkpoint, but if there's only one tree for miles around, it's going to be pretty easy for the teams to identify, hey, we're in the right place. In the race last week, I had a checkpoint which was simply two rocks, right? Now that might sound a bit weird, but it was on a path on a little kind of promontory jutting out into a lake. So people were going down this path, and it's pretty clear that you were going to find these two boulders. If you went far enough, you'd find these two rocks on the path. And in order for the teams to identify which rocks are they had a photograph in the CP location, so they knew exactly what they had to match. They could only approach it from one direction, really, and it was going to be quite easily identifiable. And it worked. You could even use things like gravestones, that the teams have to find a specific gravestone with a specific inscription on it, or, historical buildings often have a date, the year that it was built. You can use that kind of thing to identify that they've been there. But what you're getting from all of this is the checkpoints, as I say, are permanent. So this course can be run more than once. You could run it this year, and then a few years later you could run it again, or you could use those checkpoints certainly in another permutation of the race. It also means that you can take those maps and distribute them to other people who weren't able to attend your event, and you say, hey, I've got a course set up, do you guys want to go and run it? So it becomes a permanent course, just like you have permanent orienteering courses. And as you've gathered from what I've said, you take a photograph to prove you visited the checkpoint, because obviously you don't have any sort of dibber that you can dib. And it's important that you get the rest of the team members in the photograph so that everybody is forced to visit that particular checkpoint. So in a 4-person team, like I was in last week, I took the photographs and I ensured that my other 3 team members were always in the photograph. So obviously there's 4 people who visited that checkpoint. And as an added benefit of this, all the teams have therefore documented their journey around the course that you've set. So you have a whole lot of media images taken. Most teams don't bother to take photographs because they're too busy racing, but here you end up with a great collection of photographs. So it's self-documenting in a sense. Just to mention it, there is another method of proving that people have visited checkpoints, and there are a couple of apps that you can download to phones nowadays. One of them is called ARonAR. The one we used on my event for some of the checkpoints, not all of it, was called MapRun, and the latest version is MapRun 6, I think. And the reason I didn't use it for the entire event is because the event was 24 hours, and most people's phones won't run an app for 24 hours. But I had an orienteering stage on the race, and we used this MapRun app. When people ran to where they thought the checkpoint would be, the app would beep to indicate that you had reached that point. So it is quite an effective way of quickly picking up a lot of checkpoints, proving that you had visited. In this case, they didn't need to take photographs because they're using the app instead. Okay, quite a strong concern in staging an event like this, because you don't have race staff or event staff, you don't have marshals of any kind, is try and make it logistically as simple as possible. And what that's usually going to involve are loops, so out there and back. As you can see here on this particular event, we started at the race base, went out on a trekking leg to the kayaks, did a kayaking loop, then continued the trek back to the race base, at which point we then changed onto bikes and went out on a bike stage, again looping back eventually to finish at the race base. So using those out and back loops is really, really practical, because then it makes it very simple for anybody who wants to drop out of the event. Halfway through they're too tired, they can just return back to the race base. It makes it easy for everybody to manage things. There's no transportation required of any equipment or any gear, and it worked really well last week. Okay, it's a good idea, of course, if you can, to incorporate some sort of water discipline in your event. So I had a kayaking stage. Initially, I wanted to do it down a river, because I like that idea of the journey of going down a river. The simple reason that I didn't use it in this case is because the rivers in Wales, their levels fluctuate quite rapidly, and I couldn't guarantee that on the day of the event the water levels would be high enough that we'd be able to kayak down that thing. So instead, I found a huge lake. And I obviously created a loop, because that is logistically the simplest method. I hired kayaks from another company that stages adventure races, for the general public. They supplied the kayaks. They were brought to the kayaking stage. So we, on our trekking stage, ran up to this point, grabbed the kayak, went out, came back, dropped it off. All the PFDs are supplied, all the paddles are supplied. And once we went off on the subsequent trekking stage, I didn't have to think about those kayaks anymore. So again, logistically simple, really, really good idea. And if you can't hire kayaks, or it's just cost prohibitive to hire kayaks, you can always do things like get everybody to bring along a tractor tire inner tube or a car tire inner tube, and you get people pushing themselves down a river or across a lake or something like that. So it doesn't have to involve kayaks. You could do coasteering. That's really simple. Just going down a section, jumping in and out of the water. Everybody wears some sort of buoyancy aid, wear wetsuits and all that kind of stuff. So you can incorporate water stages without getting too complex or technical or expensive. Okay, when you plan your route, you're going to be obviously doing that on the computer. There are lots of free apps out there that you can actually do this. For example, Purple Pen is very famous in orienteering circles. No pun intended. But you import your map, you put the little circles where all the checkpoints are going to be. You have an order, checkpoint descriptions, all that kind of stuff. So you can use free open source software like Purple Pen, or you could just use something like Photoshop, or in a pinch you could even use something like PowerPoint. Trust me, PowerPoint is not the worst thing in the world if you're going to just import images from whatever mapping service that you're grabbing them from and then plotting the checkpoints on it. So there's lots of free resources out there that you could use to do the actual plotting of the maps. In terms of trackers, on this event I included trackers. Now, I don't always include trackers, GPS trackers on each team. The reason I did it here is because the terrain we're going into is pretty harsh. I just wanted, although I'm not taking responsibility for anybody, I thought it would be good for many reasons. One, you'd be able to get friends and family to dot watch and see what's going on, which obviously, a bit of excitement, a bit of support there. Secondly, afterwards, teams could compare their routes, and that's a learning curve, a learning experience. And a lot of people, they don't have the means, certainly on their phones or their watches, to track for 24 hours. And so hiring trackers in this case worked out really well. And just so you have an idea of cost, I hired it from one of the bigger companies in the UK that provides tracking services, and it worked out to a cost of, I think, £6.27 per person. Okay, so a very small amount for the benefit of having this tracking. And worst case scenario, if somebody did go missing and got lost, you as one of their friends could easily jump onto the tracking service and just go, I see where you are, you just need to go around the corner. So it's good from a health and safety point of view, but it's got many, many benefits. And of course, at the end of the event, we're able to spit out all the GPX files and then upload them to Strava. So really, really simple. In terms of printing the maps, there's a company I use in the UK called BML, and they do a really, really good job for printing out maps. They provide them on waterproof paper, A4 size, A3 size, double-sided, single-sided, whatever you need to do. So, there is a benefit, although you don't have to put on waterproof paper. But overall, again, I think the cost per set of maps, and we had 5 maps, was £3 per team. Although a lot of people ordered their own sets just because they wanted it, for analytical purposes, or just because they wanted a set of maps. So, but really, it, again, wasn't very expensive. So, at the end of this event, there are shared costs for all those expenditures, like the trackers, the kayaks, the race base, headquarters, hiring the facility to be able to store all our gear, and the maps. So those are pretty much the only costs that were incurred, and everybody shared equally. I didn't pay any less, nobody else paid any less, and it worked out to be very, very inexpensive compared to the normal cost of an adventure race for 24 hours long, which would have to cover the insurance costs and the permissions and all those other things. So, it really was effective. One of the other benefits of staging a proper training event like this, where you invite other teams, is that you can bring in newcomers to adventure racing. So, most of the people who attended this event I knew. A fair number, though, I didn't. I'd never met them in person before. Some of them are even the team that I will be racing in an upcoming adventure race, expedition race. So, rather than us just getting together and training, we got to compete, in this case, against each other, with each other, to learn all the different techniques and practice all these things. Closer towards the start date, I thought, well, we can accommodate a few more people. So I opened it up to other people who are adventure racers or keen on adventure racing. So through the event, some triathletes got to experience adventure racing for the first time. Somebody turned up at the race with one of my friends who had never done anything like this before, but my friend needed a teammate at the last minute. So he managed to collar this guy and say, do you want to come and try this crazy sport? And, I don't know if the guy's sold for life, but certainly he had an experience he's not going to forget in a hurry. So if you had said to those same people, do you want to enter a proper adventure race, a formally staged event, the costs on that are obviously going to be a lot higher. So this was, come along, have some fun, it's training, it's not so serious as a formal event. So there's less at stake, it's more affordable. And I'm certain that we've got some people who attended last week's event who now really know what adventure racing is about and are far more enamored with the idea and will participate in future adventure races. In terms of publicizing this event, the way I did it is I created a personal event on Facebook, a private one, so obviously only visible to the people I invited formally and or the friends that they invited to it. So I kept it private that way. I collated information, for example, all phone numbers and personal details using things like Google Docs, just sharing those documents online, sharing all the costs using the same kind of tools, or again, using the Microsoft products as well, using OneDrive and those kind of things to share information, creating forms for people to fill in all their race information, to distribute the maps. I chose to distribute the maps before the event, but only 24 hours before the event. Okay, so just to show you what the maps are like, the ones that I supplied. So, I gave each team this kind of thing before the event. It also had the GPS tracker inside it, so, done properly. So the team name would be on there. Everybody got one of these. There you can see these maps. Waterproof paper, double-sided A3, worked really well. As you can see on here, all the out-of-bounds areas are marked up in red, and the checkpoints done all in Photoshop. I printed these maps at scale, so they do match exactly the right size if you're measuring with your base plate compass to match the real thing, just like the real Ordnance Survey maps that are used out there. On the corner of the map here, I included a simple key of what people need to look out for. So what constitutes out of bounds, what a footpath looks like, what a bridleway or bike path looks like, what tracks look like, the scale of the map, because the scale wasn't natively on the map itself. I included the number for mountain rescue, so if people got into a sticky situation, they knew exactly who to call. And I included my own mobile phone number. Again, not because I'm taking responsibility for them, but as the course designer, I would have a better idea of everything. So nobody actually called me during this event, which is fine, but I just put it on there as a friend so that they had some recourse. Now, so these maps were a combination of 1 to 25,000, so the trekking on that side, and then here the mountain biking was done at 1 to 50,000, which is far more realistic in terms of mountain biking maps. And on one side of this map, because I had the space, I would have done it on another sheet if necessary. I've got all the checkpoint descriptions and the values. So that is the control descriptions. I had a short orienteering section, the orienteering map over here. And what you can see here are, not for all the checkpoints, but all the checkpoints I thought might be at all confusing. I had taken photographs and I put them over here with the descriptions. So, you could look on the control sheet for a particular checkpoint and it would say refer to picture, and they could turn over and see what exactly it looked like. So just like those two rocks that I mentioned before. And by printing it on the back of the maps, hopefully they're not going to lose their maps, right? So they'll always have these control descriptions with them at all times. So that made it really, really simple. In terms of course design, one thing that you might want to keep in mind is if you're doing a linear course, as we did last week, is we started off, initially with trekking to the kayak put-in. And I didn't want, when we said go, I didn't want just everybody rushing on one long line of people to that kayak point. So just as you get in a real adventure race out there, especially expedition type races, I had a quick prologue stage. So, the same would have applied if we were starting off with mountain biking. I don't want a group of mountain bikes all heading down the same path at the same time. So I incorporated a quick orienteering stage. And for that orienteering stage, they could get the checkpoints in any order. And it was based around the race base. And, so many adventure races take this logic. So, some people, it was the middle of the day, it's incredibly hot, hottest day of the year. So some teams ran around this orienteering course really quickly, as our team did, and maybe not the wisest idea. But some teams walked it, some people ran it. You came across teams going in different directions and everything. When people got back to the race base, then they collected their trekking gear, the backpacks and walking poles and all that kind of stuff, and then set off with the kayaks. So you ended up with the teams were on their own rather than just following whoever was in front. So that worked out really well. I recommend you do that kind of thing. Tom Davies from the UK, he recommended, he didn't attend the event unfortunately because he couldn't make it, but he said, one way you could do this is at the start line, you could say to teams, okay, ready, steady, okay, when you go, run up to the top of the hill, your maps are sitting on top of that hill. Just use whatever means is interesting to get teams to break up and not just be following each other one after each other. Okay, in terms of the order of this event, I released the overall statistics of the course. So how long is each stage and how much elevation is gained. So overall, you can see there were 11 kilometers on kayak, approximately 42 kilometers on foot, and 85 kilometers on bike, and with 4,500 meters of altitude gain within those 24 hours. I could have had multiple walking or trekking stages, multiple biking stages, but in this case I didn't do that because I was basically trying to take a snapshot of what it's like to do an expedition race rather than a very complicated 24 hours. It was just like, in an expedition race, generally in 24 hours you might be doing 1 or 2 or 3 disciplines, and generally not more than that. So anyway, that's why I chose that. The teams entering knew that beforehand, and then some of the, especially the newcomer teams, were asking me to release the maps early, like the week before the event, so they could have a quick study of the map, and really get into those maps before race day. And I specifically chose not to do that because in the real world of adventure racing that never happens. So I did agree though to release them, and I just published them online using Google Drive as PDFs for all the teams 24 hours before the start. So they had 24 hours to prepare themselves, plot their routes and everything. So when they arrived at the start, I didn't have an unfair advantage of knowing those maps before they knew them. Because obviously, as I said, I wanted to participate myself. So they had those 24 hours. And when they arrived at the start, that's when I actually gave them the physical copies. So they'd done all their planning and prep on the digital copies. But then they picked up their waterproof copy and then off they went. Nobody cleared this course, and for me that's not an issue. And for all the teams who attended, it didn't really seem to be an issue either. You just drop the checkpoints that are just not achievable within the time limit. But so, it's not like it's a perfect course. Traditionally, if you are actually staging a formal adventure race, the race director and or members of the staff would actually go out and test each stage and then work out, the minimum times, maximum times, and all those kind of things. But obviously that wasn't what I did on this event, and I don't want to do it either. I'm trying to do it all from my desk, so there's minimal investment of time on my side, and yet we ended up with a great adventure for everybody concerned. One thing just to mention that I did at this particular event is I organized that everybody who was interested could leave the race finish line and then go across to a cafeteria, could all sit down, have some food together, socialize, swap war stories. And I personally wanted that also just so I could get some feedback from people who had been out in the course and I hadn't seen them at all. Just what did they think of the events? Did they like adventure racing? Is there anything they wanted that they thought I should improve or could change? So yeah, it was very, very beneficial for me as well from the organizational point of view. And the more you do this kind of stuff, you're just going to grow the adventure racing community. It's like in triathlon, anybody can go and stage their own mini triathlon just on their own time. Same idea. And if we do more of these, we can get more people into the community and just grow it. Any feedback would be welcome. If you want to attend one of my races, just drop me a line. I'm sure I'll do another one of these next year in between the formal races that I attend. And there's adventure just waiting outside your door, as you've heard no doubt before. All right, thanks. See you on the next one.